All right. To everyone drawn to the eerie, the unsettling, and the downright unexplainable, you're in the right place. If you live for stories that send chills racing down your spine and linger in your thoughts long after the lights go out, then get comfortable, because this one hits different. Before we dive in, I've got to ask, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? The stories. The archivist who decoded a warning inside a missing person file in a small county records office tied to a quiet mountain town, a file about a long missing hiker raised concern. It arrived without explanation in a plain envelope with an outdated seal that looked wrong to the staff. Calder Rusk was 39 and worked as an archivist who handled old case materials with careful routine. He liked quiet tasks during long shifts and kept notes about unusual items that passed through his desk. He lived outside town and drove an old sedan that handled mountain roads well. His plan that day in early autumn was simple. He wanted to finish indexing property disputes from 2008 and leave before sunset. The envelope changed that plan with a sharp interruption. Its paper felt older than the date stamp, which claimed 2015. The handwriting on the label looked rushed and uneven, which bothered him in a way he could not explain. Inside the envelope sat a missing person report about a hiker named Ryan Halper, who vanished during late summer 2015. The file included faded prints that showed a trail near a power station that had closed years earlier, according to county logs. A short field note from an unnamed deputy was clipped inside the report, and that detail confused Calder. The deputy note carried a single line that read, "A warning was heard near the ridge before we lost contact." There was no signature and no follow-up page, which conflicted with what Calder had learned about normal procedure. He checked the index card drawer for the deputy roster from that year. He found a roster with a missing entry number that hinted at an unfiled edition. Calder decided to verify the report by checking archive dispatch summaries kept in a separate compact shelf. He pulled a binder marked Summer Cases 2015 and scanned each page with slow care. One entry mentioned a static-filled call from an officer near the old ridge trail where the hiker vanished. It noted that the call ended after a loud crack reported by dispatch staff. He compared the time of that call with a note in the missing person report and noticed a mismatch that felt important. The report claimed the call never connected, yet the dispatch summary claimed it lasted several minutes. He wrote both details in his notebook because he wanted a clear timeline. He planned to confirm the timestamps using recorded reel backups stored in a temperature-controlled locker below the office. The reel system was old but reliable and required a special key that he kept on a wrist chain for emergency work. He unlocked the cabinet and threaded the reel for the afternoon of the hiker disappearance. The recording started with normal chatter about trail conditions that matched weather logs filed that week. It shifted after a faint voice cut through the static, repeating a short phrase. The phrase sounded like "stay above the red markers," which made Calder pause because the trail maps from that year used blue markers. He replayed that section several times and heard a second voice say the markers were changed without notice earlier that month. He checked a laminated map from 2015 stored in a drawer down the hall. The map showed blue markers along the ridge, despite the comment on the reel. Calder wondered if someone updated the trail signs unofficially, which could confuse hikers unfamiliar with the area. He called a retired ranger named Ballen, who sometimes answered questions about old trail conditions. Ballen told him that a volunteer crew repainted the ridge trail during late summer 2015 due to erosion damage. He added that the crew reported a missing paint supply that delayed work during the final week. This detail matched a line in the missing person report that mentioned a misplaced equipment crate near the ridge boundary. Calder believed the misplaced crate might explain the repainted markers if someone used the wrong color during rushed repairs. He added that thought to his notes and checked weather data again. He found that a storm hit the ridge that same evening, which might have washed away parts of the trail. He returned to the file and noticed a small fold at the corner of a photo that revealed another handwritten line. The line said the warning was not meant for us, which made him uneasy because it echoed the earlier note from the deputy. He held the photo under a desk lamp and saw faint indentations behind the words. The indentations looked like someone wrote a longer message on a removed page. Calder used a soft graphite stick to shade the back of the photo gently, which revealed fragments of a sentence. The fragments read "trail shift noted after rails collapsed," which pointed to structural issues near the Ridge Power Station. He checked maintenance logs kept before the station closed in 2011. The logs confirmed repeated warnings about unstable railings near the ridge overlook. He suspected the missing hiker might have walked near that overlook after the storm started, which could explain the disappearance. He searched the envelope again and found a small memory card taped under the inner flap. The card held a short audio clip recorded by someone walking uphill during strong wind. The clip ended with the same phrase heard in the reel, "Stay above the red markers," spoken by a strained voice. Calder compared the wind noise from the clip with weather station data and concluded it matched the storm peak that evening. He realized the warning might have been directed at the volunteer crew who repainted the trail and not at search teams. The crew may have marked a detour with red signs that never made it onto the official map. That possibility explained the conflicting colors noted in the reel. He formed a theory that the hiker followed the new red markers, which led toward the unstable overlook rather than the safe path. The missing crate and rushed repairs might have contributed to poor placement of those temporary signs. Calder wrote a summary that connected the deputy note, the audio clip, and the map inconsistencies. He delivered the summary to his supervisor, who agreed to send it to county search coordinators for review. In the following days, a review team hiked the ridge and found remnants of weathered red paint on a fallen post near the overlook. They also found metal fragments that matched railings documented in the 2011 maintenance logs. These findings supported Calder's belief that the hiker followed an unofficial detour that collapsed during the storm. Calder knew the case remained unresolved, yet he felt the evidence finally clarified the warning inside the file. The message pointed to a rushed trail change that confused both hikers and responders back in 2015. As he closed the binder, he realized some files waited years for someone to read them in the right order. He locked the envelope in a secure drawer and left the office with a quiet sense of closure. The stories. Never open the locker marked "staff only" at this pool. It was reported that an old community pool kept one locker sealed during every shift, which matched the warning painted on its door. Local staff claimed the warning came from an incident in the early 2010s that never made public records. On a warm morning in late July 2019, a 28-year-old lifeguard named Rylan Keene started his first full weekend shift. He worked part-time at the pool while finishing a safety certification course, and he had a simple plan that day. He wanted to close early, finish his paperwork, and head home before the evening rush. The pool sat near a quiet suburb, and most regular visitors arrived with kids who stayed close to the shallow end. Rylan checked the schedule board, then walked along the lockers behind the staff counter while sipping a cheap canned coffee. He noticed a metal locker that looked older than the rest, and its front carried the words "Staff Only" in faded red paint. The manager had already mentioned the locker during training, stating that nobody should open it since the last documented key went missing years earlier. Reports from retired employees suggested the door once belonged to the maintenance area, although the structure behind it had been remodeled in 2008. Rylan always thought the story was exaggerated to keep kids from sneaking inside. That morning, he heard a dull rattle from the locker, which felt unusual since no one stored equipment there. He tapped the metal surface with two knuckles and heard something shift inside. He looked around the empty hallway and said quietly, "Anyone stuck in there?" which made no sense because the locker was too narrow for a person. The sound stopped, then a faint thud followed, which tightened the idea that maybe an animal had crawled in through the back. Rylan fetched a flashlight from the front desk and returned to inspect the vent near the locker base. Dust coated the grate, and nothing suggested active airflow. He crouched lower but noticed a small slip of paper on the floor, folded twice with the edges stiff from moisture. It looked recently placed and carried a quick note reading, "Check logs before closing time." The handwriting looked rushed, and he recognized none of the staff who wrote like that. He placed the note in his pocket and opened the office drawer where old incident binders were kept. The logs from 2011 through 2014 were thin, while the binder labeled 2015 through 2017 held several handwritten entries from night shifts. One entry from late August 2015 described a report of heavy knocking from behind the old locker. The guard wrote that he radioed a supervisor, then waited 15 minutes before the noise stopped. Another entry from early June 2017 mentioned a staffer who claimed to hear a voice calling for help from inside the wall. The supervisor at the time marked both events as unverified due to limited evidence. Rylan read further and found an archived maintenance note claiming the original access hallway behind the locker had been closed after a small structural collapse in 2010. Workers sealed the area with sheet metal and advised future crews to avoid disturbing it. The description matched the dimensions of the locker, so it seemed the locker mostly existed to cover the patch. Before he could finish the binder, a regular swimmer named Tala Pembry approached the desk to ask about the lap lane schedule. She was in her 40s and visited nearly every morning. She noticed the binder and said, "You checking the old disturbance files," which caught him by surprise because he had not mentioned anything. She explained that she swam here in 2010 when the collapse happened. She remembered a construction light falling behind the wall and a worker yelling that someone was still inside the hallway. Tala claimed she never heard what happened afterward, and she said the staff acted nervous for weeks. Rylan asked what she remembered about the worker. She paused, then said, "He was young, maybe early 20s, before walking toward the changing rooms." Her voice shook slightly, as if she had debated sharing more. He returned to the hallway with the locker and listened again. There was no sound now, only the faint buzz of old fluorescent bulbs. He reached for the handle and felt a cold vibration that did not match the ambient temperature. He stepped back and considered calling the manager, but he knew the manager would say it was nothing more than old pipes. Rylan spent the next hour monitoring the pool and checking the locker during each sweep. At 2 in the afternoon, the note in his pocket felt heavier somehow. He unfolded it again and noticed that the ink looked smeared, almost as if the message had been written minutes earlier rather than hours ago. He checked the front desk computer for any digital archive of maintenance calls near that structure. The system showed a report from 2019, only 4 months old, where a staff member logged hearing metal scraping behind the locker. The entry stated that the scraping stopped when they stepped closer. Later that afternoon, an older groundskeeper named Ward Leston entered the office to collect spare filters. Ward had worked there for more than 15 years and kept a quiet personality. Rylan decided to ask him directly about the locker. Ward froze for a second, then said, "Leave that alone. Someone got hurt behind that door long ago, and the place never settled right." He refused to explain further and left with the filters without another word. With every hour passing, the hallway felt heavier, as if the air thickened around the locker. Around 5:30, the pool emptied, and a soft tapping came from the metal door. Rylan tightened his grip on the flashlight and said, "If there is an animal inside, I have to check before closing." The tapping shifted into a sliding sound, as if something moved downward. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you need help?" which felt ridiculous, but came out naturally. To his shock, a weak voice answered through the thin panel. It sounded like a scared young man saying, "I am stuck in the hall," followed by a strained cough. Rylan jumped back, then approached again and said, "I will get help. Stay calm." He ran toward the maintenance shed and grabbed a crowbar, then returned with his pulse racing. He wedged the tool under the corner and pried, expecting the metal to bend easily. Instead, the locker door lifted sharply on its own, almost like someone had tugged it from the inside. A sharp burst of cold air hit his face as the door cracked open by less than an inch. He pointed the flashlight through the gap and saw a narrow cavity behind the metal panel. It looked like an old service corridor lined with dusty concrete. At the far end, he spotted a reflective surface that resembled a safety vest, and the faint voice called again, saying, "Please pull me out." The corridor seemed impossibly deep compared to the thickness of the wall, which caused him to recoil in confusion. Seconds later, his radio crackled by itself with heavy static that drowned all pool noise. The corridor darkened as if an unseen shadow moved closer, and the vest shape disappeared completely. The voice stopped mid-sentence, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his arms shake. He stepped backward, and the locker door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the empty hallway. He tried the handle again, but it would not budge, and the flashlight died without warning. He backed away and held his breath as the building settled. No further sounds came from the locker. Dispatch logs later stated that he reported the incident at 6:10 in the evening, though the call lasted only 9 seconds before the line failed. Management inspected the locker the next morning, but found no evidence of a corridor or any exposed space. They claimed the interior showed only plywood backing and sealed insulation. Rylan insisted on what he saw, but the staff reminded him that the structure behind the locker had been permanently filled. He wrote a full report, which was stored with older, unexplained events. Weeks later, a former construction worker visited the pool to repair a broken gate. When Rylan described the voice, the worker asked if it sounded like a man named Astor Holt, who went missing during the 2010 collapse. Records suggested he entered the service hall before the accident, though recovery teams never found him. The worker whispered that some crews believed the hall never sealed completely, and the pool carried echoes from that gap. Rylan eventually left the job, but he kept the original folded note as uneasy proof of that day. The locker remains bolted shut, and new staff are told the same warning he once ignored. Some visitors claim they still hear tapping near closing time, though it stops the moment anyone acknowledges it. For anyone walking those quiet hallways, the warning on the locker remains clear. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. The stories. Why the police sealed off this roadside chapel. The small roadside chapel sat near a quiet county highway where drivers sometimes stopped during long rural trips. Local deputies reportedly closed it in late 2019 after a traveler found something that changed the tone around the place. The building was simple, and people usually barely noticed it. The story centered on a 34-year-old maintenance surveyor named Corbin Hale, who often drove that route for work. He lived in a nearby town, and he usually kept to a steady schedule that involved checking rural drainage markers along the highway. On a mild afternoon in late September of that year, he planned to finish early so he could meet a friend for dinner. He stopped near the chapel because one of the markers behind it looked slanted, and he wanted to document it. He walked toward the spot while carrying a small camera and a work notebook. The chapel door stood slightly open, and he remembered hearing nothing except distant traffic. He planned to ignore the building until he heard a short tapping sound from inside. The sound made him pause, and he stepped closer to check if someone needed help. He called out a quick greeting but got no answer, which felt strange considering the soft tapping kept going. He pushed the door with his boot and saw dust drifting through a bright slant of late daylight. A wooden bench near the front looked recently moved because its legs scraped fresh lines across the floor. The tapping came from deeper inside the room, which held only simple furniture and a small cross fixed above a shelf. Corbin noticed a backpack sitting beside the far wall, which did not belong to anyone he had seen earlier. He stepped in and recorded a short clip on his camera to document the scene. The tapping stopped once he moved toward the backpack. He felt uneasy, which he later described in a written statement to deputies. He returned outside and found a driver who had pulled over to check a map. That driver, named Rhea Dunford, told police she had been there roughly 10 minutes and saw no one enter or exit the chapel. She agreed to wait while Corbin called the non-emergency line to report an unattended bag because he worried about possible travelers who might need help. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later, according to their logs, and inspected the chapel with measured caution. Inside the bag, they found a wallet and an old flip phone plus a folded printed photo of the chapel. The photo looked like it had been taken years earlier because the paint on the door in that image was a different shade. The wallet held no cards, and the phone battery was nearly dead, but it powered on long enough for one deputy to see 3 saved video clips. Those clips showed brief shots of the chapel interior taken during different seasons, which suggested someone had visited repeatedly. In each clip, a bench had been moved to a different spot, and in the final clip, a faint figure appeared reflected in the small window which faced the highway. Deputies later said the figure looked like a person crouched near the bench, though the image lacked clarity. Investigators reviewed old repair records for the chapel, which belonged to a small regional trust that handled forgotten roadside structures built decades earlier. The trust produced a file showing a volunteer caretaker named Myron Keats, who went missing in early 2009 during a routine supply run. His last note mentioned stopping at the chapel to drop off paint. No clear link existed between his disappearance and the backpack, except the printed photo which matched the photography style in a few older trust documents. Investigators searched local archives for any reported visits after his disappearance and found a single entry in 2015 from a driver who claimed to see a man moving a bench inside at dusk. That report named no suspect, and the driver never returned follow-up calls. Deputies used the phone clips to frame their timeline and interviewed residents who passed through the area before the chapel closure. One witness, named Avery Lorne, recalled seeing a tired-looking man near the highway in early 2017 carrying what seemed like paint supplies. She described him as quiet and focused on the chapel path. Her statement matched the trust note, which strengthened the idea that someone remained connected to the building for years. Investigators also compared the fresh scrape marks on the floor with older photos taken by trust volunteers. Those older photos showed the bench in fixed positions, which suggested someone had moved it repeatedly in recent months. This supported the idea that the visitor returned long after Myron disappeared. When they completed their review, they sealed the chapel for safety because they believed an unknown person had been sheltering there. The person possibly struggled with memory issues or untreated fear of being found, according to one unofficial summary shared with Corbin. They suspected the tapping sound came from the bench shifting under slight pressure, which fit with his description. The unknown visitor was never located, and no missing person report perfectly matched the wallet photo, though the style resembled a younger Myron. Authorities kept the case open, but treated it as a possible long-term wandering situation rather than foul play. Corbin later told friends that the chapel felt different when he drove past on later surveys. He thought about the way small, forgotten places can hold tangled stories that no one fully understands. He believed the closure made sense because it protected whoever might return, as well as anyone who stopped without knowing the hidden history. He still remembered the tapping sound and considered it a reminder that quiet places often carry quiet warnings. The stories. This park bench became the key to 5 disappearances. In many archived reports tied to a quiet suburban trail, one park bench kept showing up in every witness statement. The bench sat beside an older walking path that locals used for years, and it became the center of a strange pattern tied to 5 missing people. The story followed a 34-year-old technician named Braden Lyle, who lived a few miles from the park. He worked maintenance shifts at a small distribution center, and he often stopped by the trail after long nights on the floor. He used the spot to unwind and clear his head before heading home. His goal that morning in early autumn of 2021 was simple. He planned to sit for a few minutes and send a short message to his sister who had been asking about a ride the following weekend. Braden parked near the first turnoff, and he walked toward the bench while thinking about breakfast. The path was empty that morning, and the air felt colder than it usually did. He reached the bench, and he set his bag down while noticing fresh flowers near the base. He had seen flowers there before, but usually only 1 or 2. That morning, he counted 3 bunches, and each looked recently placed. He sat and opened his phone, and that was when he heard a faint snap behind him. He turned, but saw no one on the path. He listened for a moment, and he heard what sounded like quiet breathing near the small cluster of trees. He stood and called out a simple greeting, and he waited without moving. The breathing faded, and he felt uneasy enough to step back from the bench. A woman approached from the trail side and asked if he had heard something by the trees. Her name was Maren Ulrich, a 31-year-old caseworker who visited the trail on her days off. She pointed toward the bench and said she had seen a man sitting there 2 days earlier who vanished after dropping a small notebook. Braden asked what she meant by vanished. She explained that the man had walked toward the trees, and no one saw him leave the area based on her follow-up checks. Braden felt a chill and picked up his bag, and he asked if she had looked around for the notebook. She nodded and said she had found it under the bench. She kept it at home after failing to find a name inside. She told him she could bring it later if he wanted to see it, and he agreed since the story bothered him. She said she would return in an hour after finishing her walk. Braden stayed near the bench and looked around the clearing while replaying her account. The flowers suddenly felt more significant, and he remembered a local post from late 2020 that mentioned a missing runner who often paused near that same bench. He opened an archived article on his phone and saw a blurred photo of the bench with a date stamp. His stomach tightened when he noticed the same pattern of flowers near the legs. He walked closer to the tree line and saw a strip of cloth caught on a branch. He reached up and pulled it free, and he noticed faint mud streaks along the fabric. He placed it on the bench and took a photo for his own record. He had done informal volunteer searches before, and he knew documenting small clues mattered when nothing else made sense. A man in his late 50s entered the clearing and stopped near the bench. He introduced himself as Arvin Drexler, a retired surveyor who lived across the road from the trail. He asked if Braden was looking into the disappearances tied to the area. Braden said he was only trying to understand what happened near the bench. Arvin nodded and said he had seen similar details across several years, and each case started with someone stopping to rest. Arvin pointed to a narrow gap in the trees where old markers hung from metal hooks. He said the markers were part of an abandoned drainage project from the early 2010s. He explained that the project left several deep maintenance pits that were never fully filled, and he believed people may have fallen into an access point hidden under thick brush. Braden asked if he ever reported that theory. Arvin said he tried, but no one followed up due to limited staff and unclear evidence. Maren returned with the notebook in her hand, and she gave it to Braden. The cover felt worn, and several pages had faint impressions of older notes. He flipped through and found a short line written on the last page. It said, "Met them again by the bench after nightfall." The handwriting looked shaky, and the ink appeared fresh compared to the other pages. Braden asked where exactly she found it. She said it had been wedged between two boards under the far side of the bench. Arvin leaned closer and said he had never seen anyone place a notebook there, which made him think the writer returned recently. Braden felt the temperature shift and noticed a faint draft coming from the gap in the trees. He walked toward the marked area and pushed aside thick branches. Beneath the fallen brush, he found a concrete lip with rusted bolts. The ground dipped sharply, and a hollow space opened several feet below. He knelt and used his phone light to check for movement. He saw only old tools and a broken ladder. Yet something about the depth made his pulse race. He called out to ask if anyone was down there. No one answered, but a weak echo carried the sound back. Marin suggested checking the other side of the pit for a safer angle. They circled the clearing, and Arvin pointed to a collapsed section of fencing that partially covered another opening. Braden cleared some branches, and he spotted a shoe near the edge. The rubber looked worn, and the sole pattern matched a detail from the runner case he had read earlier. He carefully reached for it, and he noticed dry mud around the heel. Braden asked Arvin to hold his phone while he photographed the shoe. Marin stepped back to avoid disturbing the area, and she scanned the surrounding branches for more fabric. She pointed to another strip caught on a higher limb, which matched the cloth Braden found earlier. They connected the pieces and realized someone had likely moved through the gap with enough force to tear clothing. Braden called a non-emergency line and reported the discovery. He gave general details without naming the notebook and said he believed an old maintenance pit posed danger to visitors. A dispatcher said someone would check the site later, though no estimate was given. That answer frustrated Braden, and he decided to take additional photos to support the claim. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the flowers again and realized each bunch marked dates close to older missing person reports. He photographed the flowers and compared their spacing to the article images. The match felt close enough to suggest someone used the bench as a memorial or a signal. Marin suggested the writer of the notebook might have met someone connected to those flowers, and the line about meeting them again could imply repeated encounters. Braden opened the notebook once more and touched the last page. He noticed tiny indent marks above the line that hinted at a torn message. He angled the page toward the light and saw faint shapes. It looked like someone had written a location reference before removing the sheet. He took a close photo, planning to use editing tools later to enhance the impressions. They decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing before leaving, and Arvin guided them to an older fire road behind the benches. The road had cracked pavement and faded tape lines. He said he once saw a person wearing a reflective vest walking that area at night during 2018. He never identified the person, but he remembered the pattern on the vest matched old county uniforms that were discontinued years earlier. Braden connected that detail to the notebook entry and wondered if the writer had followed someone who claimed to inspect the trail. Marin said the county stopped sending inspectors to that area due to limited funding, which made the sighting even stranger. Arvin agreed and said the person may have used an old uniform to avoid suspicion. They returned to the bench, and Braden looked at the wooden boards where the notebook had been found. He noticed scrape marks near the underside. He slid a hand under the frame and found a small metal clip. It felt loose, and he pulled gently. A folded paper slipped out and landed on the ground. He unfolded it and read a short handwritten note that said, "Follow the lights near the cutoff after dark." The writing matched the notebook. Marin covered her mouth and said the message made her think someone used small lights to guide visitors toward the maintenance pit. Arvin said he once saw flickering lights near the cutoff during late 2019, but assumed they were kids playing with flashlights. Braden realized the lights may have lured curious people toward the gap. They stood silently as the idea settled. The disappearances could have been accidents caused by a hidden pit and a misleading light source. The writer of the notebook may have followed the lights and nearly fell or witnessed someone else fall. Braden suggested the writer tore out the earlier page to give it to someone, possibly a friend or an officer, yet the person never turned it in. A faint gust moved through the clearing, and Braden felt uneasy again. He gathered the notebook and folded note, and he said he would deliver them to the local station as soon as possible. Marin said she would provide her statement about seeing the notebook drop 2 days earlier. Arvin agreed to guide officers to the pit if needed. They walked back toward the parking area while discussing safer trail access. Braden looked over his shoulder at the bench, and he felt a strange pull. The bench had been a quiet place for years, yet its role in 5 disappearances seemed tied to simple mistakes, hidden hazards, and poorly understood signals left by an unknown person. The truth felt less like a supernatural mystery and more like a chain of overlooked warnings. Braden left the park with a steady resolve to push for a full inspection. He believed the answers were already there in the bench, in the flowers, and in the fragments of notes hidden under old boards. The truth only needed patient eyes to connect what had been ignored, and he hoped the next visitor would find the trail safer once those connections reached the right people. The stories. What's buried beneath that motel parking lot? In 2013, a small highway motel outside a rural town gained quiet attention after workers found strange soil layers under fresh asphalt. The case never reached headlines, but locals still mention it when strange noises come from the empty lot at night. The story centers on Rylan Mercer, who was 29 and worked as a nighttime maintenance tech at the old roadside place. He lived in a small room near the supply shed and handled plumbing issues plus late check-ins during slow months. On a chilly night in early autumn, he planned to replace worn bulbs along the back walkway before closing the service desk. He walked out toward the alley where the lot met a row of overgrown trees that blocked wind from the highway. He carried a small tool bag and wanted to finish the job before storms reached the ridge. He heard gravel shift under a passing truck but ignored it and kept moving toward the flickering lights. The first incident happened when he tried to pull a ladder from storage and felt the ground dip under his feet with a dull cracking sound. He stepped back fast because the asphalt felt soft in one oddly shaped patch near an older drainage grate. He knelt with caution and pushed a screwdriver into the crack, but found soil that felt looser than normal fill. Rylan went inside and wrote a brief note about the issue, because the motel owner wanted records of every minor repair. He grabbed a flashlight and returned outside to check the area again, since guests sometimes reported old pipes vibrating under the lot. He pressed his heel against the weakened spot and felt a faint vibration that did not match normal pipe flow. The complication grew after he asked an older guest named Hollis Grant if he had heard unusual sounds during his stay. Hollis said he heard steady tapping under the pavement around midnight 2 nights earlier. He said the tapping felt rhythmic in a slow pattern that reminded him of someone knocking through thin wood. Rylan wrote the detail in his small notebook because he wanted a full record for the owner. The next morning, he looked at archived maintenance logs stored in a dusty drawer near the office printer. He found an entry from 2009 that noted settling issues under the same section of the lot without any follow-up record. The note simply said that workers filled a shallow dip with recycled asphalt after heavy rain, but never investigated deeper layers. He walked back outside and scraped away loose chunks of pavement until he reached a thin patch of older concrete mixed with cracked gravel. He noticed faint marks in the old material that looked like parallel lines spaced evenly in a pattern similar to a box lid. He pushed his flashlight beam through the cracks and saw a dark void below the thin concrete sheet. Rylan called his friend Linton Fry, who worked part-time with a local cleanup crew that handled abandoned structures. Linton arrived after lunch and helped test the hollow area with a short steel rod used for soil checks. The rod dropped several inches into the void and produced a hollow thump that sounded too sharp for natural erosion pockets. Rylan felt uneasy but wanted clear evidence before alerting the owner. They cut a small square in the weakened concrete using an old rotary tool from the supply shed. Dust scattered across gravel as the square lifted with surprising ease. Underneath was compacted dirt mixed with thin scraps of plastic that looked melted by heat. Rylan reached in and pulled out a small strip with faded printing that looked like part of a safety warning from older storage bins. The deeper investigation started when Rylan found an old photo taped inside the maintenance log he borrowed from 2009. The photo showed the lot before renovations in 2006 and included a small storage cabin that no longer existed. A handwritten note on the back said the cabin caught fire during a storm, but details were never shared with newer staff. Rylan asked the owner about it, but only received a quiet answer that the cabin was removed after a minor electrical issue. Rylan then checked archive dispatch logs stored at the county library and found a brief call from July 2006 that reported a small fire near a roadside property matching the motel's mile marker. The call mentioned unknown materials stored inside an abandoned cabin that smoldered before firefighters cleared debris. No injuries were reported, but the log said a chemical odor lingered during the cleanup. He returned to the void under the lot and dug deeper with a small garden trowel he kept for landscaping tasks. 2 inches down, he uncovered brittle wood fibers coated in a hardened black residue that smelled faintly metallic. Linton suggested the residue looked similar to burned plastic from older industrial crates. They kept digging until the trowel struck a thin metal edge shaped like a corner bracket. They widened the hole and exposed a rectangular metal frame with charred wood inside, almost like a collapsed storage box left under the ground during repaving. Ryland found a faded barcode sticker fused to the metal, but the numbers were unreadable, except for the last 3 digits, which appeared as 416. He checked supplier records from the motel office and saw older inventory tags that used long strings, ending with the same 3 digits. The tags belonged to a discontinued supplier that shipped chemical cleaning agents in reinforced boxes. The twist came when Ryland realized the rhythmic tapping reported by Hollis might connect to shifting air pockets trapped under warped metal panels. He tested the theory by placing a board over the hollow section and stepping on different spots. Each step produced a soft knock from moving metal that echoed through the buried frame. The tapping was not from a person, but from trapped panels flexing after years of underground corrosion. He called the motel owner again with all findings and explained that the lot might contain remnants of a burned supply cabin that crews buried instead of removing fully during renovations. The owner sighed and admitted he purchased the property after the fire and assumed everything had been cleared by the previous crew. He agreed to bring in a licensed team to remove remaining material. When the cleanup team started work, they found several melted storage boxes that had fused together during the 2006 fire. The boxes contained expired solvent containers that ruptured during heat exposure. Crews confirmed the ash smell came from plastic and wood that settled unevenly under asphalt after the rushed renovation. They transported the debris to a proper disposal site and filled the cavity with stable soil. After workers repaired the pavement, Ryland walked the lot at dusk and listened for any sign of hidden noise. The tapping had stopped, and the ground felt firm under every step. He wrote a final note describing the discovery and placed it with other logs so future staff could understand the history. People still mention the motel when storms roll across the ridge because the lot glistens strangely after heavy rain. Ryland thinks the glimmer comes from newer asphalt mixing with old gravel, but he also knows that memories of buried things often linger longer than anyone expects. He told Linton the mystery felt smaller once evidence replaced fear, and Linton agreed as they locked the shed and watched distant trucks roll past on the quiet highway. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strayed, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint, distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, the radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up two old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer, almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory. The stories. What a night janitor found behind the vending machine. Roughly 10 years ago, a late-shift incident at a small distribution center led to a report that never reached public records. The file described something a night janitor found behind a vending machine after a quiet shift turned strange. Rylan Cho worked nights at a regional packing warehouse on the edge of a mid-sized town. He was 37 and had been there almost 7 years. He liked the silence after midnight and usually finished his route with music in his earbuds. On this particular night, in late spring of 2014, he wanted to clock out early and get home before a storm hit the valley. He started in the loading bay with a simple goal for the night: finish his checklist, empty the bins, and mop the narrow hallway near the break room before the wind picked up outside. The building felt colder than usual, and the air system made a steady hum that covered most small sounds. The incident began around 1:30 in the morning when Rylan passed the break room and saw the vending machine screen flick on by itself. The machine had been glitchy before, so he did not think much of it until he noticed the light did not show the usual bright menu. Instead, it looked dim with a strange gray shimmer moving across the glass. A soft tapping sound came from behind the machine. Rylan stepped closer and asked out loud if someone was stuck. He expected no reply. The tapping repeated 2 times with steady rhythm. He backed up a little and checked the doorway leading to the maintenance hall. No one else should have been there since the last forklift crew left hours earlier. He went to find the shift supervisor but realized he was alone for the next hour since the supervisor had gone to the far lot to handle a truck issue. Rylan returned to the break room and watched the machine again. The shimmer on the screen grew lighter, then faded. He unplugged the power cord to reset it, and the tapping stopped. When he pushed the machine slightly, he felt something resist from behind. The machine sat tight against the wall with no gap. He moved it a few inches and saw a narrow, dark space behind the right side panel. Something metallic glinted inside the space. Rylan grabbed his small work light from the janitor cart and angled the beam toward the opening. A metal box covered with dust sat wedged between the drywall and the machine frame. The box looked old. The lid had a faded sticker with part of a name scratched off. He reached in and pulled it free. Inside were 3 items: a small bound notebook, a thin plastic badge with a photo rubbed almost blank, and an audio recorder the size of a deck of cards. The notebook smelled musty. The first page held uneven handwriting, saying property of Hale Dorn, who worked maintenance from 2003 to 2008 based on a short training archive. Rylan later checked. Rylan remembered hearing from older staff that Hale left suddenly after a safety investigation. Nothing official remained in the shared files. Most said he moved away. A few said he had filed complaints about strange vibrations near the break room wall. Rylan opened the notebook carefully. The first entry from early 2006 described recurring knocking sounds near the vending machine as well as faint static pulses in the wall during night shifts. Hale wrote that he made several unofficial recordings, but none stayed consistent when reviewed later. The next entries grew more detailed. Hale noted timestamps, short sketches of sound waves, and small maps of the hallway layout. One entry from late 2006 described a night when the machine screen flickered with a gray wash, similar to what Rylan had seen hours earlier. Hale wrote that the tapping seemed to follow his movements around the room. Rylan turned to the last written page, dated mid-2007. It read, "I need to get someone to check the wiring before this gets worse." The lines after that looked rushed. Hale wrote that he found a small access hole behind the machine with a narrow duct running into the maintenance room. He believed air pressure changes inside the duct caused some of the sounds. The next note stated, "I still hear something moving in there, although the duct should be empty." Rylan set the notebook down and inspected the audio recorder. It contained a small tape with a handwritten label that read Night Shift Sample 2. He slipped it into his pocket with the plan to listen later under better light. He then checked the badge. The image showed Hale with short hair and tired eyes. The back listed his role as maintenance support. Rylan pushed the machine farther from the wall to look for the duct mentioned in the notes. A narrow circular opening near the baseboard revealed an old service channel that ran behind several rooms. It had not been used in years based on the dust and cobwebs. The channel connected to the maintenance room and likely carried air back when the building used a different system. He crouched closer and felt a cool draft from deep inside the channel. The draft moved in a steady pulse instead of a constant stream. When he leaned nearer, he heard a faint scrape followed by two soft taps. He jumped back and called out if anyone was inside. No reply followed. Rylan stood still and waited for another sound. 3 minutes passed quietly. He reached into the opening with the work light and shined the beam across the first few feet. Dust floated in the narrow space and nothing moved. The scrape sound did not repeat. He repositioned the vending machine and photographed the channel opening so he could show the supervisor. He then finished his route feeling uneasy. When his shift ended at 3, he took the notebook and recorder home. Later that afternoon, he listened to the tape. It began with low background hum, likely from the old air system. 30 seconds in, a rhythmic tapping started. It matched the pattern Rylan heard earlier. The tapping repeated 4 times, then stopped. Hale's voice spoke quietly, saying, "I know the duct is empty, yet it keeps making that pattern." The tape ended with a short static burst. Rylan cross-checked the tape with archived maintenance logs from 2006 available through an internal server. He found a note about air pressure complaints near the break room, but no follow-up reports. The log mentioned Hale's concern about a possible leak inside the service channel and recommended an inspection that never occurred. Rylan met with the supervisor the next night and showed the findings. The supervisor listened to part of the tape and agreed that the sound pattern matched what past crews mentioned during older shifts. He filed a report to the facilities manager, who arranged a full inspection later that week. The inspection team removed the vending machine and opened the service channel. They found a partially detached metal flap deep inside that moved when the air system cycled. The flap created repeated taps during pressure changes, which explained the pattern recorded by Hale. Inspectors also found old tools left behind by a previous contractor, which caused the scrape Rylan heard. The team sealed the channel, repaired the flap, and recommended replacing the vending machine wiring due to aging components that caused the strange screen flicker reported by both Hale and Rylan. 2 weeks later, the warehouse returned to normal. The tapping never came back. The recording was archived inside a general maintenance file, and the notebook was stored with other historical documents kept for internal reference. Rylan kept thinking about how one small discovery behind a vending machine connected him to someone who tried to document the same odd sounds years earlier. He believed Hale had tried to solve a problem that no one else seemed to notice until the notes surfaced again. The story lives quietly inside a handful of reports, and one old tape that proves how simple, overlooked issues can create experiences that feel much stranger than they are, especially during long nights when empty hallways amplify every sound. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice, asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker, the nurse who refused to enter room 6 again. Lila Farnes first heard about room 6 through a short entry in an old staffing report that mentioned unusual overnight disruptions. The report was dated to 2009 and came from a small regional clinic that sat outside a quiet town with limited medical resources. Lila was 33 and worked as a traveling nurse who filled short contracts in understaffed facilities. She arrived at the clinic during early autumn when the halls felt calm and the night shift moved slowly through predictable routines. Her simple goal that week was to keep a steady rhythm while saving money for a move planned for the next spring. On her second night, she was assigned a rotation that included room 6, which held a recovering patient named Dorian Pike. He was 62 with a mild respiratory issue that required observation but posed no immediate danger. His chart suggested stable progress, which meant the room should have been an easy stop during her quiet rounds. The incident began when Lila stepped inside the room and noticed a faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the wall near the bed. The patient had been awake, and he watched her with an uneasy expression that suggested he wanted to speak but hesitated. She asked if he needed anything, and he answered with a flat, "Please keep the lights on tonight," which struck her as odd, given his preference for darkness noted earlier by the day nurse. During her next pass, the tapping returned and felt sharper, like something struck the wall with steady intent. Lila checked the hallway and found nothing unusual beyond a supply cart resting near a closed door. She reviewed maintenance notes later and saw that workers had previously inspected the wall after a similar complaint in 2006, yet found no loose utilities or structural issues. The complication deepened when a nurse on the shift before hers mentioned archived calls made by former night staff. Those calls reportedly described patient distress related to sudden cold drafts that moved through room 6 even when vents were shut. Lila filed this in her mind, but kept her focus on what she could directly verify, which meant returning to the room with a calm approach and simple checks. When she entered again, she saw Dorian clutching the call button with both hands and staring at the same wall that had produced the tapping. He whispered, "They move through here," which confused her because he had no history of disorientation and his oxygen levels looked normal. She tried reassuring him, but he pointed toward a small framed print that hung crooked like someone had pushed it earlier. Lila documented the scene, then stepped into the hallway to compare notes with the evening charge nurse named Brenton Shaw. He was in his late 40s and had worked the clinic for many years, which gave him perspective on long-standing issues. Brenton admitted that room 6 had frequent incident logs related to unexplained noise, but he never saw anything dangerous, so he kept assignments unchanged. The investigation began after Dorian reported that someone had touched his arm during a period when no staff had entered the room. Lila checked the security panel near the nurse's station, which showed timestamps for door openings captured by the badge sensor. The logs indicated her previous visit, followed by a long gap with no recorded entry, which made his claim puzzling. She then reviewed older patient notes from 2003 to 2008, which described brief episodes of agitation from individuals with no history of anxiety. Several mentioned hearing movement behind the wall near the bed, and one wrote that a picture frame had tilted during a quiet stretch. These details were small but consistent, which encouraged her to look for a physical explanation. Lila asked the maintenance lead named Corbin Rusk to inspect the wall after her shift ended. He brought a handheld thermal scanner and ran it across the surface while she watched from the doorway. The tool showed a thin vertical band of cooler temperature that did not match the building layout, which suggested an unregistered cavity or narrow chase behind the drywall. Corbin returned during daylight with a small borescope camera designed to look behind tight spaces. He located a hidden seam in the corner that had been painted over during earlier renovations. When he guided the camera inside, they saw a slender gap between structural supports where unsecured pipes ran without proper insulation, which explained both the cold drafts and the intermittent tapping. The twist emerged when Corbin followed the pipes farther and discovered that the cavity connected to an abandoned service chase sealed decades earlier, according to archived renovation notes. That chase once linked several rooms, including room 6, where older patients had repeatedly complained about footsteps at night. The noise likely traveled along the hollow space and grew sharper as the building shifted during temperature changes. Lila returned to Dorian with the findings, which eased his fear because it gave something concrete to replace earlier uncertainty. She watched him relax when she explained how air moved through the gap and how small vibrations struck the wall during normal settling. He nodded and said, "That makes more sense than what I thought," which helped restore predictable routines for the rest of his stay. The payoff became clear a few days later when the clinic sealed the gap with proper insulation, which stopped the tapping that had bothered so many night staff over the years. Lila felt relieved because the solution fit every clue she had gathered from logs, witness comments, and earlier maintenance records. She no longer feared the room and worked her shifts without hesitation. Still, she remembered the moment she first stepped into room 6 and sensed tension that felt older than her short assignment. She knew many stories deepen when fearful people misread unfamiliar sounds, but she also understood how convincing those moments can feel. Later, she often said that small mysteries usually shrink under steady checking and clear evidence, which matched her experience at the clinic. Lila finished her contract without further issues and moved to her next job carrying a quiet confidence shaped by those nights. She still thought about Dorian and the relief in his voice after learning the real cause behind the unsettling moments. Room 6 stayed sealed and silent after the repairs, which meant future patients would sleep without wondering what moved behind the wall. The stories. This photograph found in a mailbox changed everything. The photograph turned up inside a rusted mailbox behind an old duplex that once housed 3 families during the late 2010s. It reportedly connected to an unsolved disturbance that drew police cars for weeks without any formal statement from local officials. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a junior claims adjuster who spent most days reviewing accident photos sent by clients across the region. He had driven out to the duplex to help his cousin move into a cheaper place after a messy breakup that happened earlier that year. He wanted a quiet afternoon with simple tasks that could end before dark since the neighborhood felt uneasy even in daylight. The plan changed when he noticed the leaning mailbox behind the fence with its lid jammed open from years of sun damage. Something inside caught the light in a way that bothered him, and he reached in without thinking much about it. His hand closed on a stiff envelope with no stamps and only a smudged date that looked like it read 2014. Inside was a single photograph that showed the back lot of the same duplex, with a figure standing near a basement door. The figure seemed to stare at the camera, even though the face was blurred under the bright reflection that hit the glossy print. A handwritten note on the bottom edge read, "He never left," and the words felt rushed, as if written during real fear. Rylan showed the photo to his cousin, who shrugged and said the basement had been locked for years due to repeated flooding. His cousin had heard faint stories from the previous tenant, who claimed someone used to sleep down there during colder months. Nothing in the story felt sharp enough to explain the strange energy captured in the photograph. Rylan slipped the photo in his backpack, then walked around the duplex yard for a better look at the angle shown in the print. He matched the line of the fence and the shadows from a nearby power pole until he reached the exact spot where the unknown person once stood. His phone timestamp showed late afternoon, yet a sudden chill moved through the air even though the day had been warm. He took a quick photo of the canal behind the duplex to document conditions since he handled evidence types for work and trusted that habit. Something shifted behind the basement door, and he stepped back while telling himself it was only loose wood pushed by the wind. The handle rattled once, which unsettled him more than he expected. A neighbor named Corby Henshaw walked out from the adjacent unit and asked if Rylan was looking for the old inspector who used to check the lot. Corby looked about 50 and carried a half-empty grocery bag that gave off a faint scent of detergent and onions. He said the inspector came around every few months to confirm no one had broken into the basement. Rylan showed Corby the photo, and the man stiffened before saying he recognized the reflection pattern on the figure's jacket. Corby claimed the image matched a maintenance worker named Talon Griggs, who vanished from the property in late 2014. According to Corby, the disappearance never gained attention because Talon was young and moved often without telling anyone. Rylan asked if police ever searched the duplex, but Corby said they mostly checked paperwork, then suggested Talon left town for seasonal work. Corby lowered his voice and explained that several tenants reported hearing dragging sounds under the floor during storms after Talon went missing. Rylan listened with growing concern because the basement clearly leaked heavily and could hide debris without much notice. He returned to the basement door and studied the warped wood for any sign of fresh marks that might show recent attempts to enter. A faint groove near the latch suggested someone had slipped a tool inside within the last few months. His job trained him to recognize forced entry signs even when the damage seemed minor. Ryland decided to search public records at the small municipal office across town to see if any maintenance reports mentioned Talon. An older clerk named Mavis Kelter helped him check archived building logs that covered routine inspections and emergency calls. She located a brief entry from late 2014 stating that the maintenance worker assigned to the duplex never completed his shift. The entry ended with a note about a tenant hearing a loud crash near the canal path behind the property that same evening. No follow-up report existed, which troubled Rylan because something clearly disrupted the worker's schedule. Mavis encouraged Rylan to check the microfilm station since older incident summaries sometimes went unprocessed in the main system. He scrolled through grainy reels until a short police dispatch log from early the next morning appeared with a simple description of possible trespasser behind duplex. The log ended without resolution, yet two initials of responding officers matched names Rylan recognized from regional accident investigations. It remained unclear why the officers never wrote a complete summary. Rylan contacted a former coworker who now handled risk assessments for vacant structures and asked if he recalled any issues near that duplex. The coworker remembered an odd request from a landlord who wanted an estimate for reinforcement of a basement hatch rather than a full cleanup. That recommendation was denied due to insufficient documentation, which meant the door probably stayed weak for years. Rylan returned to the duplex the next morning and found the backyard quiet except for the hum of distant traffic along the main road. He held the original photograph beside the current view and noticed a missing gutter downspout that once directed runoff away from the basement. Water had carved a shallow trench that led directly to the exact spot where tenants heard dragging noises during storms. He moved closer to the door and pressed his ear against the wood to check for echoes that could reveal hidden cavities behind the interior wall. A faint hollow sound suggested a gap large enough to hide debris that might include personal items left by Talon. He reached for the handle, which gave slightly, as if someone recently replaced a rusted hinge without securing it tightly. Corby approached again and warned Rylan that previous tenants avoided the basement after a courier discovered an old backpack wedged behind a drain pipe. The courier returned the bag to the landlord, who claimed it belonged to a temporary worker, yet no one retrieved it. Rylan realized this detail lined up with the approximate time of Talon's disappearance. He asked Corby where the landlord moved and learned the man relocated to another county after selling the duplex in 2021. Rylan checked property records later that day and found a short transfer note indicating the landlord left behind several unclaimed storage boxes. Those boxes were marked as low priority during cleanup, which meant their contents might still sit in a small maintenance shed. Rylan walked to the shed behind the duplex and spotted 3 dust-covered boxes stacked under a sagging roof tile that drooped toward the canal. Inside one box, he found scattered papers, including an old shift sheet with Talon's name and a checklist mentioning repairs near the basement hatch. Another page listed a complaint about a foul smell rising through the floorboards after heavy rainfall. He took photos of the papers, then looked up when a sudden gust rattled the shed door hard enough to shake loose dried leaves. The wind pushed a loose shingle that clattered onto the ground near his feet and broke apart in a puff of dust. The noise startled him, but reminded him that the property had been poorly maintained for years, which supported the idea of an overlooked accident. Rylan returned to the basement and used a small pry bar from his cousin's toolbox to loosen the frame without causing obvious damage. The door opened with a dull crack that carried through the quiet yard like a tired breath escaping from a sealed room. A wave of stale air rolled out, followed by the faint scent of metal and wet soil. He stepped inside and turned his phone flashlight toward the far wall where the drainage pipe curved behind a pile of rotten boards. Something glittered near the edge of the light, and he reached down to pick up a crushed reflective jacket with a missing zipper. The reflective pattern matched the same glare seen on the figure in the original photograph. A small utility tag sewn to the jacket listed the initials TG, which aligned with Talon Griggs, and confirmed Rylan had found evidence connected to the missing worker. He dug through debris nearby and uncovered an old clipboard that held one final maintenance note describing a sudden collapse caused by shifting soil near the hatch. It suggested Talon was preparing to reinforce the area before something destabilized the ground. Ryland followed the damaged soil path toward a narrow cavity under the floor where water pooled during storms and carried loose items into deeper pockets of mud. He found scattered tools with dried corrosion that indicated the worker likely became trapped by collapsing debris during heavy rainfall. The shifting soil and poor structure could have hidden the incident from sight for years. He contacted local authorities who reopened the case and confirmed the basement conditions created a perfect scenario for an unnoticed accident involving a lone worker. Officers documented the findings and credited Ryland's persistence for revealing the long-ignored evidence that connected the photograph to the missing maintenance report. Corby watched from the fence with a quiet expression that mixed relief with sorrow. Weeks later, Ryland returned to the duplex before his cousin finished moving in and paused near the mailbox where he first found the photo. The rusted metal still leaned forward, as if trying to offer one final warning about secrets left unmanaged in quiet neighborhoods. He understood now that the image was not a threat, but a trace of someone trying to signal unfinished work. He placed a small flower near the fence, then stepped back toward his car while thinking about how easily small details vanish when people move on. The photograph no longer felt ominous because its message became clear through patient evidence and careful listening to forgotten reports. Ryland left with a quiet respect for the worker whose final shift had been frozen in that single frame. The stories. The final log from a lighthouse on a foggy coast. A faded coastal report from 2008 mentions an unsigned log found inside a shuttered lighthouse during routine maintenance. Workers said it looked recent, even though the building had been locked for years. The discovery triggered a quiet review that centered on one man named Corin Halbrook, who once served as the tower caretaker. Corin was 39 and worked as a part-time dockhand in a nearby fishing town, and he checked the old structure whenever storms rolled through. He liked the quiet building, and he felt responsible for keeping it safe because his late father had worked there decades earlier. On a cold morning in early autumn, he headed out with a simple goal, which was to finish a roof inspection before the fog returned. He hiked the narrow path with his tool pack, and he noticed the fog drifting in faster than expected. A supply boat sounded its horn, and the echo pulled his attention to shifting shapes that moved across the water. He reached the lighthouse door and found fresh scrape marks on the metal surface, and that detail threw off his routine. Inside, he heard a soft clatter from the watchroom above, and he paused because no one should have been there. He climbed the steep stairs, and the air felt heavier with each step because the tower trapped the fog that seeped through old seams. When he reached the top landing, he noticed a lantern lit on the small desk, and he knew he had not left it there earlier that week. He read the open logbook and saw an entry written in a neat hand that did not match his script. The note described a boat drifting without lights near the shoals, and the timestamp matched the previous night. Corin wondered who had written it, and he checked the radio shelf and found a handheld set powered on with low battery. He stepped outside to scan the water, and the fog swallowed most of the horizon except for a dim shape moving slowly near the rocks. He raised his binoculars and saw what looked like an old skiff listing toward a channel notorious for hidden ledges. He called a warning through the radio, and he waited for a response that never came. When he hurried back inside, he noticed another fresh line in the logbook, and it read that the skiff had no operator visible on deck. The handwriting appeared slightly rushed, and Corin felt a jolt because the ink looked wet. He checked the stairs and heard faint steps descending, even though no one passed him on the landing. He followed the sound to the service room, and he found a damp jacket draped over a chair that had been dry earlier that week. The pockets held a small notebook with water stains, and the pages carried brief notes about frequent, low fog and strange lights near the channel. The most recent note mentioned a voice over the water calling for help, and Corin closed the book because the air suddenly felt colder. He decided to document the building for safety, and he used his small camera to take photos of the fresh marks on the door and the lit lantern. He moved room to room, and he captured the damp jacket along with the notebook because he wanted evidence for the harbor office. When he checked the time, he noticed the fog outside turning a darker shade, and that sign suggested another weather shift. He stepped out on the gallery to examine the water, and he heard a low groan coming from the direction of the shoals. He could not see the skiff anymore, and the silence that followed pressed against his nerves. He returned to the watchroom and prepared to close the logbook, and that was when he noticed a final half-written entry near the bottom of the page. The unfinished line described a man on the gallery waving toward the tower, and Corin froze because he realized he had just been on that same walkway. He checked the door and found it closed tight, and he felt sure no one had entered while he moved through the rooms. He read the last words again, and the implication unsettled him more than any storm he had faced. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks, as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log, discovered months later, matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive, where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker.